So, are you ready to take just a deep breath? A breath to say Christmas and all the preparation and all of the chaos of the season is done. For some, people had to go home. Maybe you were the ones that had traveled and you too had to find time to go home. Some of you may have be already at home. Maybe you never left, but now home is empty. So home is different for you, maybe in this story. But I want us to bring today some closure to the preparation that we did. I want us to take literally this time to reflect on some things that went through this season. Now, we took some really unique approaches to Advent and to Christmas this year. Thank you for journeying with me with an open mind and an open spirit. But I want to continue a little bit of that as I bring to you a story out of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, right from the very beginning, is talking about a husband who had two wives, the one being Hannah. Now, the one wife had no problem having children, but Hannah, on the other side, didn't have children. And each year, they would go to the priest and to make their sacrifices. And Hannah every year would pray that this would be the year that she would conceive and have a son. And she finally said that if I have a son, I'm going to make my firstborn a gift to you, God. And that seems strange that you want to have a son, but you want to give the son away. Well, you have to put it in context. If you didn't have a child and you were married, you were looked down on. You were not respected like other women in the community would be. You felt ill at ease around other people. But if she could have just had a child, and even if that child was far, far away, she would move up in her status. But I think she too just wanted to have a child of her own that she could love. And so God heard her prayer. And she had the child. She presented it to the priest. And the priest then and her made a date for her to bring the child back when the child was old enough to begin to serve in the court there. And so every year when her and her husband would go up for their annual time of making a sacrifice, she would make for her son, Samuel, a tunic. And every year Samuel would get a new tunic. And couldn't you just see when she arrives, like, oh my, you've grown so tall. Here, let me add more to let out the hem, and so it's a little longer. She may have made some nips and tucks, and maybe he was too thin or was gaining some weight. But she took this time every year to reconnect with her son. So let's read a portion of what happened during this time. So it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 18. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. His mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year, when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord repay you with children by this woman for the gift that she has made to the Lord." And then they would return home. And the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So, here we see a story of a family that was excited to have a birth. But then, could you imagine how it would tear at her heart to give Samuel up? And then every time she went to visit him, the anticipation, the joy of what is coming, just like the joy that we have in the build-up to Christmas. We don't know how long they stayed, maybe a day, maybe a couple of days, but every year she knew in her heart that she had to leave Samuel there and to go home. She had to go home. Now, like I said, there was joy, but then there was the sadness. Let's take a look at some of the characters that we've encountered over the years as we have looked to Advent and looked to Christmas. So the first we want to look at are the shepherds. The shepherds were out in their field. The shepherds were one that could not participate in the temple because they were ceremonial unclean. They were out in the wilderness taking care of the sheep. The sheep that were used for sacrifice, they were clean, but they weren't. I find it interesting that God repeatedly, over and over again, makes a stand, makes a standpoint, makes us become completely aware that the message of the gospel is for everyone. And how many times do people feel unworthy? How many times do people feel that this just couldn't be for them? And so as the angels sang and they awakened the shepherds in the field that night and told them to go find the baby Jesus, the lowest of the low were the ones to come and to worship Jesus. Isn't that exciting? Isn't it exciting to know that nobody is meant to be left out, that everybody is welcome to this table that Jesus has offered to each and every one of us? But here's the thing. We don't know how long they stayed at the stable. I'm sure that they had work that they had to get back to, and so their length of time wasn't very long. And so what did they have to do? They had to go home. What would that trip going home be like? Did they go home in silence, pondering in their heart like Mary did? What did this mean? Oh, did it really happen? Can we believe what we saw? Then maybe it was just the opposite. Maybe it wasn't quiet. Maybe they were all just hopping and skipping, and I don't know if they did high fives back in the day, but something probably similar, and just being overjoyed and overwhelmed with what had just happened, and they couldn't contain themselves. But then they arrive home. They've got a story to tell. Could you imagine how many times they heard this or they told the story? Now put yourself in the opposite situation. First off, say the wife or the child or the parent. Yeah, okay, well, that's a nice story, but then they hear it from all the other shepherds, and so maybe there is this sense of belief that it really happened. But how many times did they tell the story? And finally, I can just see the eye rolls. Oh, Benjamin's going to tell the story again. Benjamin, how many times must you tell us the story? Yes, there was angels. Yes, there was singing. And yes, there was a baby. Yes, Benjamin, we get it. What would life be like for them up on the hill as they went back to work? I mean, they all experienced it, so they can't relive the story as if it was something new. to each other. So, but they had to process it. They had to become willing to just let it go in some ways. But yet, I can just see anytime somebody new came across their path, hey, let me tell you. Let me tell you what happened. I think that's kind of neat, is that they had a story to tell. What about us? Do we have stories that we can tell of what Jesus did in our life? Do we mark it down? Do we really recognize it? Do we identify this was a time that God intervened? Well, let me tell you something that happened just a little time ago. I was on my way to Rochester and we had to stop and get gas, and I got back in the car and thought nothing about it. And then when we arrived partway to Rochester, we wanted to stop at a restaurant, get something to eat, and I turned to Kristen. I said, "Where's my phone?" "I don't know." Fortunately, she has a phone tracker. She tracks my phone because I'm noted to do this often, leave my phone somewhere. So she got on the phone tracker and she said, "Well, your phone is right here." And we looked and we looked and we searched the car over. We could not find it. So as I came around from the passenger side to submit the loss of my phone, and yet again I'd done something dumb, I happened to hear my phone ring, and it was laying on the back of my car. It had lodged itself somehow in the little ridge next to the trunk. And there it rode all the way from Belmont, all the way to Dansville. A miracle. Nothing short of a miracle. Something that God did in my life, because I pray for blessings every day, and I was blessed to get it. So that's one little story I have. Do you have stories that you can share with other people of what God has done in your life? How he's carried you through a moment or two? Well, let's look at another set of characters from this story. The Magi. If you don't know much about Magi, the Magi were noted historically. They're not just unique to our Bible, but they are throughout the history of that time as kingmakers. They would peer into the heavens and they would see that a king was born. And they would travel to that country to present gifts fit for a king. And that's what they did. They traveled all the way following the star from their land of Ur, the land where Abram came from, and they traveled all the way to this little tiny country called Israel. And there they went to the king, and they expected to make a king. But instead they were met by a king that had no newborn child, and so they were sent on a mission to find the child. But an angel along the way, after meeting the child, told them to go home a different way. One, so they were protected, and two, so that the child would be protected, so that the king would not know where the baby was, because now King Herod was out to destroy whoever was about to take over his throne, and so he killed so many of the children. But their lives were changed, their lives were transformed. They had traveled not as a believer in a new Messiah, into a new king, but just to make a king. They were important people. But on the way home and during their reflection, their lives were transformed in that they had met the King of Kings. Even though it was a baby, they knew in their heart that this was going to be the Messiah. How would that change their lives? How would that be when they got back home to those who were around them, that they had met this Jesus, this new king? Their lives were changed. Mary and Joseph, They didn't have children before. And so when they went home, first they had to go through Egypt. So they made a home, they made a place where they began to experience what it was like to be new parents with a newborn baby and not having family around. So all of what they learned on the job. So their home was unsettled. This is the Messiah. This is the one that comes to save the world. And here the three of them are trying to figure out what to do with the newborn baby. The Joseph and Mary and then Jesus, we don't know how long it was before they went home, other than the fact that he grew up enough that he was probably 2 or 3-ish before Herod died and it was safe to go home. But then they had to go home to their home to the people that knew them, and to put up with sly comments. You know, they didn't know that they were having the Messiah. They just knew that Mary had a baby before they had gotten married. They had to go home to live in shame. Don't know if they had support from their parents, but I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that they were willing to take them back in and to help this new family, to set Joseph back up into his carpentry business. So think about what their life would be like in going home. Now let's think about us. It is time for us to go home. We've heard the story. We've heard the story our entire life. Every year we hear the story. But it's this year, are we going to let this story settle in, maybe a little bit different? Are we going to begin to tell the story like the shepherds? Are we going to be transformed like the Magi to know we went into it with one idea and we came home with another? Are we going to be like Mary and Joseph who are struggling to figure out what to do with this new story? But we have a story to tell. We have the story to tell of Jesus coming into this world, but we have a story to tell on how this Jesus radically transformed us into who we are today. And we need not be ashamed of who we are. We need not to hide it underneath a bushel basket. Let me get that thoughts put together. We don't need to hide it underneath a bushel basket, but we need to let our light exposed. So as we burn bright, then the more that we encounter others who burn bright, we become like a forest fire, and people will be drawn to exactly what the story is. Let me pray. Holy Spirit, I pray that as we begin to reflect upon this season, that you'll remind us of different truths that we had learned. But most importantly, help us to begin to take this message to a world who needs to hear. This world who is so divided and so upset and so longing for truth, that we could rise above that chaos and to bring Jesus, who is the one who was to bring peace. And we put this into your holy name. Amen. We'll see you next time.